All right, thanks for sticking with us. Our final speaker of the day is Dominic Kulikowski. He has a BS degree in Environmental Resource Management from Penn State University, an MS degree in Ecology also from Penn State, and a PhD in Geography from the University of Colorado. He's worked on as a research scientist for the University of Colorado and for the Swiss Federal Institute of Snow and Avalanche Research, where his work focused on forest disturbance in the Rocky Mountains and the European Alps. He's currently assistant professor at Clark University's School of Geography in Massachusetts, and his current work is focused on mountain pine beetle outbreaks as well as dynamics of quaking aspen in Colorado. And I may have misspoken on who traveled the farthest yesterday, so I'm willing to have it be a tie between coming from Massachusetts and from Alberta. Dominic, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for sticking around and not taking a nap or going for a hike or something like that. I wanted to start with a map of the distribution of quaking aspen across North America. And this is a map that we've seen a number of times already the last couple of days. This map is important for a couple different reasons. One, it's a testament to the fact that it is important to understand the ecology of aspen. It is important to understand the types of things we've been talking about for the past couple of days. But also, and this theme has come up a couple times today, the other implicit thing in this map is because of the tremendous geographical range in aspen, there's bound to be significant variation in the ecology of aspen. So that means that if we understand something about aspen in one region, it doesn't necessarily mean that we understand the same thing in another region. So with that in mind, we live in a time of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. We wish to restore ecosystems. We would like to restore the West. A couple questions that immediately come to mind are, one, which ecosystems are in need of restoration? Given the tremendous geographical range of aspen, it's reasonable to assume that the need for restoration also varies geographically. The second question is, to what condition should we restore these ecosystems? What is the object? What is the goal of our restoration? And to address this point, yesterday Paul started out by talking about the historical range of variability. This idea is that the historical range of variability refers to forest conditions and the abundances of species that existed in ecosystems prior to major modification of those ecosystems by white settlers. Since these conditions are representative of the conditions under which ecosystems evolved and perpetuated, they provide a very compelling model of sustainability. And indeed, a lot of our management efforts aim to maintain ecosystems within some range of historical variation. Now, because a range of conditions is difficult to describe, focus is often placed on only a snapshot of an ecosystem. These snapshots are very helpful, but we're still talking about snapshots of naturally fluctuating systems. We're talking about snapshots of a moving target. So what are the consequences of that? Well, so in this figure, on the x-axis we have time, on the y-axis we have some parameter. It can be the abundance of species, it can be stand structure, it can be any host of things. And the vertical bars represent events, disturbances, if you like, that shape an ecosystem. And the point here is that ecosystems that are affected by relatively frequent events, relatively frequent disturbances, are likely to exhibit a relatively narrow range of historical conditions. Now, in contrast, if you take an ecosystem that historically has been shaped by infrequent events, infrequent disturbances, if you like, there's likely to be a broader range of fluctuation in species composition, in stand structure within those ecosystems. So what are the consequences? The consequences are that if we take one snapshot of this ecosystem, our selection of the time period isn't that crucial. We're going to get about the same idea of the ecosystem if we take the picture here as if we take it here. But if we only have one snapshot of this type of ecosystem, we risk underestimating the breadth of variability within that ecosystem. In other words, we're going to get a very different picture of an ecosystem if we take a snapshot right here, as opposed to if we take a snapshot right up here. So what's this have to do with quaking Aspen? Well, of course, one of Aspen's regeneration strategies is by prolific resprouting, following stand replacing disturbances. And this is a photograph of quaking Aspen resprouting following the fires of 2002 in Colorado. The fires came in, they removed the canopy, spruce, fir, and aspen, and they created conditions for the prolific resprouting of what we generally recognize as a shade-intolerant species. But, and we've heard about this earlier today from Dale Bartos and others, even though we normally think of aspen as being a shade-intolerant species, aspen sometimes does form self-replacing stands, such as this one, or such as this one, which, based on our dendrochronological reconstruction, is a pure aspen stand that has not experienced any type of major or severe disturbance for at least the past 250 years. But, of course, one of the things that has us alarmed and has us talking are images such as this, which show the successional replacement of aspen by the shade-tolerant conifers, in this case, subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. We know the story. These conifers reach the canopy, and on a landscape scale, what we see is a decline of aspen. Well, so we have these two scenarios. We have persistent aspen stands, and we have aspen stands that are being successionally replaced by conifers. And of course, we also do have aspen stands that are being replaced by shrublands, but for the purpose of the talk today, I won't address that part of the story. But the couple questions that immediately come up are, one, over what extent is aspen being replaced by conifers as opposed to forming self-replacing stands? The second question, again, a spatial question, a geographical question, is where do each of these trends prevail? We have a limited amount of resources. How do we locate the stands that are in need of restoration? And then finally, and I would argue maybe most importantly, depending on what our goals are, how does this process, or how do these processes fit into the long-term dynamics of these forests? So most of the data that we have that show a decline of quaking aspen are data that show the decline over the past several years to several decades. We've heard and we've all read a number of very compelling studies showing very definitively the decline of aspen over the past several decades. What I would like to introduce into the conversation is a longer temporal perspective. Because I think we can agree that if we observe a decline of aspen and the longer historical variation is something like this, then this is one type of scenario, and that's going to lead to a certain set of conclusions. In contrast, what if part of what we're seeing is something like this? As long as we're only looking at several years or several decades, it's hard for us to put the current decline into a longer historical context. And this is also likely to vary spatially. So one of the main reasons why we talk about aspen decline is because of fire suppression. So let's think about fire regimes and fire suppression for a moment. In this upper figure, represents a story with which many of us are familiar, right? So this is a story of the ecosystem that was shaped by frequent fires, probably low severity. We had European settlement around 1800s, 1900s. We have fire suppression, and we've seen a number of excellent studies showing important changes in ecosystem structure, composition, and function in those types of ecosystems. It's also true that as correct and compelling as that story is, it does not apply to all ecosystems. And I would also argue that it doesn't apply to all aspen ecosystems. The bottom graph shows a different type of ecosystem, and of course we're talking about endpoints on the continuum here. But the bottom ecosystem has been shaped by, let's say, fires that have occurred on the order of 100 years or many centuries. There are a couple of important differences between these two types of ecosystems. One is that if we have a fire-free period of 50 years, 70 years, or longer during the 20th century, it's likely not to be unprecedented based on the long-term historical record. And our effects of fire suppression are also going to differ between these two ecosystems. In the upper ecosystem, in 50 years of fire suppression, it's likely that we would have prevented 5, 10, 15, 20 fires. Here, maybe 1, maybe 2. The other critical difference between these two types of ecosystems is, if you accept the argument I put forth earlier, it's logical for us to expect a broader range of conditions in this type of ecosystem, a wider fluctuation, especially on a centennial scale, of the abundance of any given species in that ecosystem and the prevalence of any type of particular stand structural class. So we're talking about Western Colorado. The studies I'm going to show you are from Western Colorado. The last major episode of forest fires in Colorado prior to this present decade was in the late 19th century. Because severe fires favor Aspen, the question becomes whether or not the extent of Aspen has increased or decreased since the late 19th century, right? In the time period prior to the last major episode of fires. Right? So we're asking the same question, but we're just expanding the time period over which we asked it. So this work was done in two areas, one in the Grand Mesa National Forest, and another slightly north in the White River National Forest. Normally when we do work in ecosystems that are characterized by severe disturbances, we have the problem that the most recent disturbances erase evidence of pre-disturbance vegetation conditions. But in this work, we had a couple of very unique resources with which to work. In 1898, the USGS produced a series of maps for what were then the forest reserves, which are, of course, the precursors of the national forest. This particular map of the Grand Mesa area shows topography, it shows the vegetation, it shows in the red here, the extent of forest fires, recent forest fires, meaning 1890s, 1880s, and the pre-fire vegetation. Right? So we took this 100-year-old map and we entered it into a GIS. Here we digitized polygons that represent the vegetation as it existed prior to the forest fires of the late 19th century, prior to the last major episode of widespread fires. And then here's the extent of the fires in this particular area. And over top of that, we overlaid modern vegetation. Right? So the yellow here is aspen, the green is spruce and fir. And I should say that these data were produced in I think 2002, so they actually predate the observations that Jim Worrell reported on earlier. And I think one interesting thing to do potentially in the future is to take a look at the data as they are right now, or maybe in a couple of years, and see whether these conclusions change. But we're talking about data produced in 2002. Oh, and we also went into the field and we verified the positional and compositional accuracy of both the modern R2Veg data and this historical map. And if you want to talk about that more, we can, but in short, both were highly reliable. So this is perhaps the simplest, but maybe most important thing that I want to share with you. So here the bar graphs represent the amount of each vegetation type that existed in this Grand Mesa area. here in the late 19th century and here in the late 20th century. And the yellow bars represent the amount of quaking aspen. It's simple and it's stunning that if we look at the vegetation as it was prior to the last major episode of forest fires and compare it to the present being 2002, there's actually more aspen in the landscape right now than there was 100 years ago. Interesting, because it means that our answer to the question of whether or not aspen is declining not only varies geographically, but the answer to that question is also going to vary depending on what time frame we're talking about. Over the past 20, 30 years, has aspen declined in this area? Yes, we have very compelling data for that. Over the past 100 years, has it declined? No, it hasn't. So, when we ask a question like this, we need to make specific the time period that we're talking about. So, where did this increase in aspen come from? So here, the columns represent the forest type as it existed in the late 19th century, and the rows represent the forest type as it was in the late 20th century, meaning around 2002. And here we have two categories of burned and unburned. And this is a simplified table. If you want to see the full table, I think there's some publications on the table in the back where you can examine that. But a couple of interesting things, right? So where did this increase in aspen come from? Well, what we see is that of the area that was dominated by the conifers, spruce and fir, prior to the fires of the late 19th century, that was burned, 62% of that area is now aspen. Right? We understand why that would be. We have a mechanism for that explains the increase of aspen in the Grand Mesa area. But here's the other interesting thing. Of the area that was unburned aspen, right, over 100 years ago, it was aspen. It was not burned in the late 19th century. 78% of it is still dominated by aspen in the absence of disturbance. This is interesting. Right? So we see two things here. We see a conversion of the conifers to aspen by means of the severe fire, and we see almost 80% of aspen persisting even in the absence of severe disturbance. This breaks down areas where aspen has increased, persisted, meaning no change, and decreased between these two time periods. And what we see, and this has come out in other talks today too, is the area where aspen has decreased in the Grand Mesa area is really concentrated here at the highest elevational zone. At the highest elevational zones where the conifers, spruce and fir presumably have some sort of competitive advantage. Most of the area at mid and low elevations, we find that aspen has either persisted or increased. And here's another interesting part of the story. So here, the rows represent the forest type as it existed prior to the fires of the late 19th century. In other words, all of these stands were aspen prior to the fires. All of these stands were conifer prior to the fires. We visited 30 stands in this area, and we categorized them as being either self-replacing or seral based on the presence of advanced regeneration within these stands. Seral means an aspen, and these are all, the canopy is dominated by aspen in all cases. Seral means that there's an abundance of conifers in the subcanopy. Self-replacing means that there's an absence of conifers below some threshold and an abundance of aspen. So what we found is a very strong relationship such that stands that were dominated by aspen prior to the fires of the late 19th century are largely self-replacing today. Where we find seral stands in the Grand Mesa area, as it turns out, those stands were dominated by conifers prior to the last major episode of fires. So we have a successional replacement of aspen by conifers occurring by areas that were dominated by conifers 150 years ago. So is this a decline of quaking aspen or not? Again, the answer to that question depends on what time frame we're talking about. And I'll briefly mention we looked at another area. This is the Flat Tops Wilderness of the White River National Forest. And here we had a slightly more complicated story because for some reason the same person made both maps, but in this Flat Tops map there was a category of an aspen conifer mix. We had our hands a little bit tied in terms of the comparison. But if we look at the upper row, we see that in the late 19th century, about 9.1% of the landscape was dominated by aspen. Right now it's about 25%. This is a little bit problematic, but even in the very unlikely case that this aspen conifer mix was 100% aspen in the late 19th century, at the very least, what we see is no decrease in aspen over this longer time frame. Probably there was an increase, but our data aren't as good in this particular area. And the interpretation of this should be obvious. So, no, I'm just kidding. So this is what happens, right? You complicate one variable and everything becomes a mess. I'll just point out a couple of things. One is that of the area, and this is set up in a similar fashion as the other table, of the area that was burned, spruce and fir, we have a 41% conversion of to aspen, right? Okay, that makes sense. Of the area that was unburned aspen, about 45% is still aspen. In the Grand Mesa area, it's 78%. Could this be some north to south gradient? It could be. We only have 2 points. It's definitely not a certain thing, but there's some vague suggestions that there might be a difference between the more southern and the slightly more northern area here. And here we have this transition table. Again, we find a very similar pattern, such that the majority of the stands that are cereal in 2002 were actually dominated by conifers 100 some years ago. Right? Again, but again, the relationship here isn't as strong as in the Grand Mesa area. Could this be a geographical gradient? It could be. But the important thing here is, if we're worried about the decline of these stands, and these stands were in fact dominated by conifers 100 some years ago, can we truly call it a decline of aspen in these areas or not? So in this area we identified what we can essentially call persistent or stable aspen stands, as well as cereal stands. So we became interested in the regeneration dynamics within these categories of stands. And generally speaking, in the literature, we can identify 4 major types of modes of regeneration. Catastrophic, meaning regeneration following stand replacing disturbance. Right? This is what we can normally think of when we think about aspen. Gap phase dynamics, right? Regeneration following the death of individual trees. We have the option of continuous, and we have episodic. The age structure of episodic looks similar to that of catastrophic. The difference is that there is an absence of disturbance here. So we visited a number of these sites located across these 2 study areas, and we identified 8 cereal stands, that is, stands that were dominated by conifers 100 some years ago that are now aspen. And we looked at 18 persistent aspen stands, 18 stands that have persisted over the past 100 some years. And here the methods were, this was a thesis done by Brian Kurzel, who's now with Colorado State Parks. And for his thesis, he used intensive dendrochronological reconstructions of these 20-some stands that we selected. And I'll just show you the results of a couple of these. So here we have the distribution of the age distribution of aspen in a selected stand, and here is the age distribution of subalpine fir. Here we have the size structure of each. this is an example of what we interpreted as a catastrophic regeneration mode. We're used to seeing this sort of thing, we're used to thinking about this sort of thing. Following the disturbance, so this was burned in the late 19th century. We have conifers establishing immediately after the disturbance, and we have the shade-tolerant conifers coming in afterwards.
Is the age distribution of the stand age, or distribution of all the trees in the stand?
I'm sorry, yes. So these are trees within one particular stand. Yeah. And the stand is F7. Okay. We also found a couple of stands that exhibit a continuous regeneration mode. Typical negative exponential distribution. We have stems establishing almost every decade. And then we also had a number of stands that fit in episodic regeneration mode. This was interesting because these were stands in which we observed no evidence of severe fires, and yet these stands showed this unimodal age distribution. And in some cases, it was a bimodal age distribution, and I'll just briefly touch on that with the 10 seconds that I have left. So the summary of what came out of this work is the majority of serial stands, the majority of stands in which conifer and aspen play the successional game, Aspen's regeneration strategy is catastrophic. But of the persistent stands, we found 7 stands in which the regeneration strategy was tied to disturbance, but 9 in which the regeneration, as far as we could tell, was not tied to disturbance. And there's something peculiar about these episodic stands. So we found 3 stands with 2 distinct cohorts, 100 years apart. We found 2 with saplings in the 100-year-old stands. Again, there's this 100-year difference. And in a bunch of other stands, we again found this 100-year difference, this bimodal distribution. And this is an age structure that we see in the literature quite often. And I have some theories about this, and if you want to know them, ask me. But to sum this up, what we found in western Colorado is that, one, aspen has persisted across most of its range over the past century. Again, we're talking about a longer time frame. The net effect of disturbances in the late 19th century has increased the amount of aspen in this area. And the key point here is that there's a larger portion of the landscape that is presently dominated by aspen than in the late 19th century. And the take-home message with the regeneration modes is that even in an area of western Colorado, we find important spatial variation in the modes by which aspen regenerate in this area. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take a question or two. Yes.
Yeah, Dominic, I understand a map that was made in 1898 that described the current vegetation at that time. I wonder about the quality of that map. Could you maybe give a little more detail of how they describe the vegetation pre-burn? That's always baffled me a little bit. And your confidence in the quality of that estimation of that vegetation.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I actually struggled with exactly the same problem, and I think that might be the reason why these maps were sitting in the library for 100 years, because who would possibly start analyzing something like that? The map, in addition to the vegetation, the map depicted the topography of both areas. So the means by which I entered into a GIS was essentially tying mountain peaks, river junctions, other prominent physiographical features to the known location of those features based on 1 to 24,000 USGS maps, the digital versions. Then you sort of stretch the map across the landscape. Based on 30 control points, the root mean square error of those points was about 125 meters. So, and we're talking about a map that's at a scale of 1 to 250,000, right? So the spatial accuracy isn't quite as good as what we would expect from a modern USGS map, but we're still talking about a positional error of plus or minus 100 meters on average, which was extraordinary considering that this was made by a couple of guys on horseback triangulating off of peaks, right? Now, so that's the positional error. The compositional error we address by visiting on the order of 30 or 40 stands within each of these areas. We went to these stands and we reconstructed the composition of the forest in those particular stands using tree ring methods. Part of this work was related to the Aspen work that we were doing, another part was related to, we were also studying outbreaks of spruce beetles. So we were studying spruce and fir forest, and we were also studying aspen. Given an error of plus or minus 125 meters, all of the sites that we went to, we found that both the historical map and the modern vegetation were correct in terms of what we would expect to be the canopy dominance 100 some years ago. Now, your question about what was there prior to the forest fires. So the forest fires in this area occurred in the 1880s. The map was published in 1898, and the surveys were done in the early 1890s. So the chapter that accompanies these maps doesn't explicitly describe the sampling protocol, but my assumption has been that it was based on the identification of the standing dead trees. So you and I can go to Yellowstone still and describe what kind of vegetation was there prior to those fires. Yes.
Could you talk about the mechanism for the episodic improvement and replacement?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. And we talked about this more in the paper that came out last year in Forest Ecology and Management. The hypothesis that we're entertaining right now is essentially cohort senescence. So this is a hypothesis that's been applied to various forest types globally. The forest types in which it fits usually share certain characteristics. They tend to be dominated by tree species with very distinct lifespans. The stands tend to be made up of one or two species of trees, and the trees that dominate those stands tend to be genetically similar. Right? So that all sounds familiar. The idea of cohort senescence is that periodically canopy trees die in order to make conditions more favorable for either the resprouting or the establishment of seed of the same species. And there's reason to believe that if a canopy dies in a very short time period, the conditions will be more favorable to the regeneration of that species as opposed to if the canopy mortality is slower. So in the case of aspen, if we have sort of a gradual demise of the canopy, we could imagine that this could create conditions for the encroachment of either conifers or shrubs. But if you have a very instantaneous short-term mortality, maybe something like you've observed, and that's why I was very curious about the regeneration you were seeing, could that actually set up conditions that are more favorable for the persistence of aspen in that particular stand? I don't know, but that's the idea that we're playing with.
How about other large-scale disturbances like Alex Home?
In this particular area? Yeah, we didn't address that particular disturbance. One of the first things that came to mind when we found this is, the forest fires were incorrectly mapped. Because it's a 100-year-old map, so maybe there's some problem there. Maybe there was logging. The written accounts for both of these areas indicate very minimal logging activity in this area, very little harvesting. also the accuracy of these maps in terms of the fires of the late 19th century was so good in the conifer areas where we could test it reliably that we believe that indeed they weren't forest fires. But in terms of other disturbances like that, I just don't know. Yes.
I missed what you said. Were the fires predominantly natural or man-caused during that time?
Yeah, so this was the 1880s, early 1890s. There was a period of drought in western Colorado, and there was a conflict between Native Americans and European settlers. It's not really clear what the ignition sources were, but what is clear is that the climatic conditions were right for widespread fires. And in these higher elevation areas, one of the things we see in the long dendrochronological record is that forest fires are consistently associated with the same drought conditions that occurred in the late 19th century. So the jury's out on the source of ignition, but one of the things that is true is that probably if the ignition source wasn't human, then lightning would have done the job.
Curious if were there any studies done on the overall age of these clones, particularly the seral clones? Sounds like a lot of what you did was on the above ground stems. Are we to assume that this is reestablishment of new clones, or are we talking about the same clone reestablishing itself?
We didn't study that part of it. My assumption would be that it was indeed resprouting.
So these clones could have been, we don't know about it.
That's right, yeah. And actually, in the flat tops area, there were pretty extensive fires in 2002, and we had done some work in that area prior to that. And we see clonal resprouting of Aspen in stands that were previously dominated by spruce and fir, even in stands that, based on our tree ring reconstructions prior to the fires, were on the order of 200 or 300 years old. So, which implies that the sucker was just hanging out there waiting for the fire.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. If you want to talk to Don.